This new technology is driving me wild. Oh yeah, oh, baby, I can't stop dreaming of the desktops.
While often mistaken as the term for late 90s and early 2000s general trends, the y2k aesthetic was actually an aesthetic all in itself. It categorizes the trends that celebrated futurism and technology, fueled by a young generation optimistic and excited about the millennium. Beginning roughly in 1995 and lasting until 2004, it provided almost a decade full of innovative and exciting space-inspired styles. So let's get into it and take a look at the future that could have been. Background. The beginning of the y2k aesthetic can be credited to the fast rise of the dot-com bubble. This was a stock market bubble, where massive growth in the use of the internet caused many investors to eagerly invest in any companies that had a .com in their name, regardless of their actual potential. This produced a sort of temporary insanity in the business world. To get investors interested, companies often added .com to their name, even if it had nothing to do with the internet, and spent excessive amounts on promotions, such as lavish parties called .com parties, or million-dollar commercials before they'd even made any profit. But this insanity represented a cultural optimism towards the future of technology. At the beginning, the .com bubble was a key player in the economic growth of the 90s, so we celebrated technology in all visual corners of the culture. Additionally, exciting other technologies were rapidly developing and becoming commercially available, like the iMac, Windows 95, PlayStation 2, electronic music, cell phones, technological toys, graphic design programs, and special effects in film and television. This commercial explosion enhanced our love and fascination with technology. And we were also fastly approaching the new millennium, a period in time that for the entire century was seen as far in the future, and for the most part, we were extremely excited. However, the y2k aesthetic is named after the y2k bug, which was a potential computer error predicted to occur when computers would not be able to distinguish 90s dates from 2000s, and upon the millennium would fail and subsequently bring down global economies. People were legitimately terrified that the new millennium would actually be the beginning of the end of humanity. But when it passed and nothing happened, the President of the United States, Bill Clinton, called y2k the first challenge of the 21st century successfully met, and it felt like we had avoided disaster. This only increased our excitement about the millennium, and for a while it seemed like the future was a place of boundless possibility. A kind of techno-utopianism permeated the era, the belief that technology might be able to bring us together and solve world problems. This creativity and optimism created a fascinating aesthetic that showcased the boundless potential of human imagination when it comes to technology. The future had arrived, and it was powerful, shiny, and exciting. Clothes. As we do in any aesthetic, we first need to look at the fashion influences so that we can understand it more deeply. The y2k aesthetic is not the first time futuristic themes have had a dominant influence on the look of an era. The 60s space age began with the launch of Sputnik in 1957, the first artificial satellite orbiting the Earth, and reached its peak with the first human moon landing in 1969, which was watched by over 500 million people around the world and was one of the defining moments of the 20th century. This interest in space led to a dominant futuristic aesthetic of the 60s that infiltrated many fields of culture, including home architecture, TV shows, and of course fashion. Designers began experimenting with new shiny and synthetic materials and sleek designs of futuristic fantasies. Innovative designers like Mary Quant, André Courrèges, Pierre Cardin, and Paco Rabanne incorporated space elements and unisex uniform styles into their designs. This period of 60s fashion would heavily influence the y2k aesthetic 30 years later. The second influence on the y2k aesthetic was a rise in street and sportswear in the 90s, thanks mainly to hip-hop culture. Street and sportswear styles are defined by their practicality and casualness that is comfortable and easy to move in. They emerged in fashion during the golden age of hip-hop in the 80s, but became popular in the 90s. Here, hip-hop artists would often incorporate street and sportswear styles into their music videos and performance attire that were often a part of their everyday lives and fundamental to their street culture. The commercial success of hip-hop during this time turned sportswear and streetwear brands into household names, and many of the trends into the epitome of cool. Particularly relevant to the y2k aesthetic were baggy and loose unisex styles. The final influence was various components of 90s and 2000s culture that influenced the aesthetic. Firstly, there was rave culture, which peaked in popularity in the 90s and early 2000s, even being the topic of movies and a Time magazine cover in 2000. Raves were all about love and unity amongst the experience of techno music, and so their look was often a mix of functional clothing optimal for dancing and experimental styles paying homage to the futuristic techno sounds. This could often include the influence of non-Western styles, which was perfect for the Y2k aesthetic, which was optimistic that future globalization would bring unity and a merging of all cultures. Then there was the commercial music industry, hip-hop, rock and roll, R&B, boy bands, dance pop. All of these genres not only embraced the Y2k aesthetic, but helped define some of its key features. Music video director Hype Williams popularized the high-tech sets, shiny synthetic outfits, and warped fisheye perspectives. And it was also extremely common for pop music albums to feature futuristic motifs. It was things like this which helped to legitimize the aesthetic. And lastly, there was the sci-fi phenomenon The Matrix, which was released in 1999 and had a massive influence on culture, particularly fashion. The sleek leather and all-black costumes were perfect for the futuristic Y2k aesthetic, and they even inspired a Christian Dior couture show. This combination of 60s space-age trends, functional sportswear and streetwear, rave utopia, and pop cultural influences created a versatile, innovative, commercially viable, and still unique style that celebrated the idea that humans merging with technology was bound to be a futuristic utopia. Fabrics and motifs. Y2k was not defined so much by specific items, but rather futuristic fabrics and motifs that dominated the aesthetic. While there are some individual items we'll be covering, essentially a Y2k look can be created with many different kinds of items, too many to put into one video, but all of them adopt these futuristic motifs that are central to the aesthetic. So let's look at the list of these. 1. Synthetic shiny materials. They are fundamental to this aesthetic. This can include patent leather, holographic and iridescent material, and metallics that are usually silver resembling metal. Shiny fabric was first used by 60s space-age designers to showcase their futuristic ideas. There was a synthetic fabric called Cardin, developed by Pierre Cardin, a shiny spacey rainwear collection by Mary Quant, and aluminum and chainmail dresses by Paco Rabanne. These textures and fabrics are synonymous with space fantasies, and Y2k took direct inspiration from this, often placing general 90s trends in these shiny fabrics for a futuristic twist. 2. Utilitarian chic, or clothes that are fashionable for being useful and practical rather than glamorous or even attractive. They were usually unisex items that were sturdy, light in fabric, and adorned with functional add-ons like zippers, drawstrings, and pockets. Designers like Marc Ecko and Prada Sport contributed to this trend with their collections around the new millennium, characterized by sleek synthetic materials and durable and practical silhouettes. However, the trend again can be traced back to 60s futuristic trends, where designers often visualized future fashions as simple and practical uniforms. 3. Translucency, such as sheer materials that were sometimes layered, clear PVC material, which was extremely popular, and even inflatable clothing. While translucent fabric was long considered scandalous for women, this changed when Missoni accidentally sent transparent items onto the catwalk in 1967, and then the trend really took off. Y2k's love for 60s fashion might be why they incorporated this fabric, but translucent fabric is also seen as technologically advanced and therefore futuristic. During the Y2k era, many architects, digital artists, and technology companies worked with translucency because of its futuristic appeal. For example, translucent iMacs were released in 1998. They were extremely popular and likely influenced or at least complemented the fashion trend. 4. The colour palette. The Y2k aesthetic had a distinctive colour palette of white, silver, of course for space, black, dark green, and blue. The aesthetic did use all different colours of course, but these were the main players. Okay, now let's get into specific items. Pants. The cargo pant was a crucial item of the Y2k aesthetic, a utilitarian unisex style. They were comfortable, easy to move in, perfect for rave culture, and usually adorned in many zippers and pockets. They were first designed for military men in 1938 as part of their battle uniform, but it was actually the hip-hop performers in the 90s who first brought them into fashion, and then they became massive, even appearing in Ralph Lauren's runway show of 1998. It gave way to the rise of loose-fitting pants, which were a distinctive look of the aesthetic, channeling both utilitarian and sportswear influences. Taking note from the synthetic shiny fabric motif, silver metallic pants resembling space pants were extremely popular, and were considered both futuristic and fashion-forward. Leather and patent leather pants were also a big part of this aesthetic. While the leather pant trend I covered in the McBling video was more about rebellion and rock and roll, the y2k leather pant was more about a futuristic uniform. They were usually monochromatic and part of an all-leather ensemble that resembled a sleek space super agent. In fact, there was also a rise in the leather catsuit, which has been a sexualized fashion item since the 60s, but it's also associated with extreme sports, female superheroes, female supervillains, and female adventurers. The style is therefore not only a sexualized item for the y2k era, but a nod to the space super agent imagery they were trying to create. And they also created this imagery through full leather dress ensembles. Jackets. Y2k jackets were a mix of highly stylized items and casual silhouettes with a futuristic twist. Leather or patent leather long jackets were the most iconic. They were of course straight from the popularity of The Matrix, where characters like Neo and Trinity enter the Matrix and are transformed into all-leather ensembles. They were therefore perfect for the y2k aesthetic's own symbolic entrance into the future. Windbreakers, coach jackets, and puffer jackets were other essential items to the aesthetic. They were mostly introduced to fashion through hip-hop as streetwear and sportswear items, often suiting the cold climates hip-hop came from. Indeed, all three of these items were originally designed to withstand cold weather, making them practical and utilitarian as well. They also have some history in the 60s space age trends. The puffer jacket was similar to the space jacket, also sometimes seen in the aesthetic in very memorable style moments. And in the 60s, NASA actually commissioned futuristic designer Pierre Cardin to design their spacesuit. Meanwhile, the windbreaker was known as a futuristic raincoat in the 60s that could compact into a high-tech utilitarian package. Tops. Body-tight t-shirts were considered part of the y2k futuristic uniform, and were mostly seen on boy bands. They were often in textured fabrics like neoprene or wetsuit, and tucked into large pants like cargo pants, which made them look like a military t-shirt and cargo pant combo. But it was also similar to 60s fashion, such as the tight upper body garments of Cardin's Cosmo Corp suits, which were a landmark moment of 60s futuristic fashion. Then there were high-neck tank tops, which were also historically associated with military fashion. They were an extremely popular silhouette of the y2k era, being durable, simple, and utilitarian. Vests also became an important utilitarian style of y2k, usually a nylon or a synthetic material and styled as cargo, plain, puffer, or hooded. And on a side note, many other hooded silhouettes were popular too. The cargo style was utilitarian, being similar to nylon military vests and body armor, while the puffer style came from the puffer jacket trend. And the hooded style was also a nod to practicality and historical associations with sportswear. Midriff revealing tops, such as crop tops and bras, were often worn throughout the aesthetic in many different ways. As described in the McBling video, underwear as outerwear and crop tops are essentially celebrations of female liberation. But unlike McBling, in the y2k aesthetic, they were more utilitarian, often paired with baggy cargo pants, giving the aesthetic more of a sportswear look, especially when sports bras were included. TLC and Aaliyah first made this popular as an alternative to typical body-hugging feminine trends. Dresses and skirts. The mini hemline played a big part in this aesthetic. I've already covered their history with feminine liberation in the McBling video, but their history with 60s futuristic fashion is a whole different thing. Prior to Mary Quant bringing the miniskirt to mainstream fashion in the 60s, short skirts had already been worn by 1950s sci-fi characters, who then went on to be a major inspiration in 60s futuristic fashion. The y2k mini hemline was seen in both skirts and dresses and celebrated the 60s futuristic influence on its era, creating sci-fi heroine silhouettes. On the other side of the spectrum, long skirts were just as popular a trend. Long skirts were made y2k futuristic through lightweight, synthetic, and sometimes shiny fabrics, or utilitarian cargo style with pockets and zips. But there was also the skirt over loose pants trend, which was a strong indicator of futuristic and non-Western influences on the aesthetic. Skirts were styled in various ways over loose pants, including plain miniskirts, or the skirt was in a slit style resembling pleats. The skirt in a slit style was reminiscent of ancient Japanese skirts, such as the kusazuri, a style of pleats worn as armor by 12th century samurai warriors. And this association with Eastern styles symbolized the influence of non-Western trends on the aesthetic. Cyborg imagery. Experimentations with cyborg imagery were a key part of the y2k aesthetic. This was largely due to a rise in biomorphic designs and special effects technology during the era, and also utopia feelings that humanity and technology were merging. The term cyborg comes from the 60s space age, describing someone who is a mix of machine and human and can survive extraterrestrial environments. It's a loved idea of sci-fi imagination, particularly in the subculture of cyberpunk, which often creates dystopian science fiction worlds that include cyborgs. However, the cyborg imagery in y2k was more sleek and optimistic, likely due to a cultural excitement towards technological advancement. Things like space superhero silhouettes, alien-inspired looks, and tech-savvy styles. Assisting with this look was the fact that wearable technology boomed during the era and caused a lot of excitement. For example, the first smartwatch was released in 1998. The company Zybernaut released the first wearable computers called Pomas, and Philips collaborated with Levi's in 2000 to create a jacket with a built-in MP3 player and cell phone. It's also interesting to note that cyborg imagery was often seen in high fashion throughout the era too, which shows just how pervasive it was. Accessories. Bags. Translucent and often inflatable backpacks were an iconic y2k design. The rise in popularity of translucent material that gave a technologically advanced and futuristic look was definitely responsible for this, and the bag also reflected a broader y2k trend of inflatable furniture. They were inspired by the 60s space age, where inflatable furniture became a trendy part of space age creativity. Avant-garde architecture created inflatable futuristic designs, and the first mass-produced inflatable chair was created in 1967. And then inflatable furniture structures became a fixation of designers throughout the 60s. Hardshell backpacks with strong sci-fi aesthetics were also a big part of y2k, with one example being the Bobbly Megalopolis backpack, which was created as an extra sturdy, highly functional, spacious, and protective design. While it was made for outdoor enthusiasts, the high-tech utilitarian and futuristic design suited the y2k aesthetic perfectly, and it even appeared in Macy Gray's futuristic utopian Do Something music video. And finally, there was a rise in utilitarian-style bags. Nylon and Velcro messenger bags came into style. I covered their history in the hipster video, being a super spacious and functional design for workers. Small utility pouches were also popular, largely thanks to Prada. They were worn across the body or waist and have their history in compact military pouches that were sturdy and designed to be practical in size, so perfect for utilitarian y2k. Sunglasses. Sunglasses of y2k were both sleek and experimental, embodying efficient yet imaginative futuristic designs. To go along with y2k's love of sportswear, Oakley's efficient and utilitarian designs were a key y2k item. Prior to the era, Oakley eyewear was synonymous with sport shield lenses. This changed when the Oakley eye jacket was released at the beginning of the era, and became both an everyday style, action sport item, and a crucial y2k trend, inspiring many similar styles. Another popular style was the X-Metal, especially after Tom Cruise wore them in Mission Impossible 2. Oakley's sports technology and functional styles became the personification of y2k extreme futuristic cool. Small oval-shaped glasses, sometimes with a minimalist metal frame, also came into style. They're another one straight from The Matrix, and they were perfect for the aesthetic because of their association with sci-fi rebels, and because of their simplicity and practicality, making them pretty utilitarian and cool for their uncoolness. The small frame inspired the trend of tiny sunglasses in the era that were often in colour. And then there were goggles. They're a utilitarian item designed to protect one's eyes against extreme weather, and so were bringing a sportswear element to y2k. But also they were a futuristic 60s space age trend as well, through such designers as Pierre Cardin and André Courrèges. The y2k era took inspiration from this and often wore them on the head rather than on the eyes. Shoes. Y2k shoes revolved mostly around turning the practical fashionable, and the most quintessential shoe trends were sports sneakers. They complemented the aesthetic's love of sportswear and functionality over glamour. This utilitarian item was perfect for dancing rave culture, and got extra points if they were laceless for practicality, or made futuristic through colours, materials, and technological add-ons like flashing lights and built-in rollerblades and platforms, which were really popular in rave culture. In fact, platform shoes of all kinds were popular for y2k. Think platform slide-ons by Steve Madden, or platform boots on the Spice Girls, who often adopted a playful space-age aesthetic. They were a recreation of popular late 60s and 70s platform shoes, also known as the party shoe, and they were made for attracting attention in the developing disco scene. But the platform in y2k had a distinctly futuristic aesthetic, seen as otherworldly and innovative. Even slightly platform sandals made their way into the aesthetic, and they were mostly hiking sandals and therefore designed to be super comfortable, practical, and functional over glamorous, making them a perfect utilitarian garment for the aesthetic. And finally, there were tall boots, which were inevitably going to come into this aesthetic. Sci-fi heroines have long been associated with tall boots, and also André Courrèges released the go-go boot in 1964 to go along with his new space designs. The y2k aesthetic often incorporated the go-go boot, taking direct influence from the 60s space age, and tall boots to create the sleek and powerful space agent aesthetic. Gloves and arm cuffs. Furthering the utilitarian and futuristic aesthetic, gloves and arm cuffs were a dominant trend of y2k, even in the rave scene. The y2k aesthetic was drawn to fingerless gloves, which were usually associated with sportswear, such as with cyclists, rollerbladers, and motorcyclists. Meanwhile, the armed cuff trend was similar to ancient armour worn on the arm, also known as the gauntlet. The armour aesthetic was celebrating the fantasy that humans could be in the space age as efficient and powerful agents. Jewellery. The y2k aesthetic didn't place a lot of emphasis on jewellery, favouring a utilitarian style. However, there were two main accessories that added emphasis to this futuristic look. Firstly, there were chunky chokers and bracelets, which was likely inspired by 90s trends where chokers had become extremely popular, and the 60s space age where big chunky chokers helped create the futuristic aesthetic. Meanwhile, the chunky bracelet, when given a futuristic twist in its materials and combined with the chunky choker, almost resembled armour, creating the illusion of a capable and powerful space agent. Secondly, there were rubber watches. The most popular of these was the Baby G, designed for the G-Shock line by Casio, which was primarily for sports and military use. However, this watch targeted female youth through pop colour palettes. The rubber design made them shock resistant and durable, so they combined the utilitarian aspect of the aesthetic, and it was such a popular item that rubber watches in general became an essential accessory. Technological accessories. Aside from the wearable technology already discussed as part of cyborg imagery, there were other tech accessories that didn't necessarily create the cyborg aesthetic, but were a celebration of rising technology. Firstly, there were portable CD players known as Walkmans. First seen in the 80s, they became more sleek in design with Sony's release in 1997, and then they became extremely popular. There was also the slow rise in popularity of cell phones. They weren't nearly as popular yet as they would be in the 2000s, but interest in this technology was growing. The biggest brand of the era was Nokia, mainly because they catered to youth and fashion-orientated consumers with colourful designs. For the y2k aesthetic, Nokia's experimental and futuristic designs were the most popular, particularly the 3300, 3650, and 7600. Hair and beauty. As you can probably guess, space-age experimental hair and makeup defined the aesthetic. However, some general trends of the 90s were often incorporated into it too. Beginning with futuristic-themed hairstyles, there was firstly short braids tied across the head, and they were likely inspired and then probably appropriated from styles of box braids, which connect back to braids worn by women of the Bantu tribes from Namibia. Box braids were also a dominant style of black y2k hair. There was also the style of twisted strands of hair across the head, which was experimental and came across as technologically advanced. They were likely inspired by dreadlocks, which have a broad history but mostly became popular in Western culture through the appropriation of Rastafarians. Additionally, unnatural hair colours also came into the aesthetic, especially in rave culture. They created an otherworldly look and played with futuristic imaginations of what humans could look like when merging with technology. Space and spiky hairbands were a crucial hairstyle with the aesthetic, creating clear symbols of sci-fi imagery and sleek space heroines. Spiky hair silhouettes have had a long-standing association with space. Meanwhile, the space buns are associated with sci-fi through Princess Leia in Star Wars, whose hairstyle was supposedly inspired by early 20th century Mexican female revolutionaries. However, they were first worn by Native American Hopi women. Another super popular bun style of the y2k era were Bantu knots, and they originate from Bantu-speaking tribes of southern and western parts of Africa. But for the y2k aesthetic, they were a multicultural style which probably symbolized a future where all cultures merge. Short, sharp electric bobs that were extremely straight helped create a futuristic look, and other experimental hairstyles resembling extraterrestrials were a big part of the aesthetic. Taken together, these styles are symbols of sci-fi imagination, space warriors, and non-Western influences. Popular trends of the 90s/60s was also incorporated into y2k with a futuristic twist. The aesthetic adopted the sleek and futuristic high ponytails, which were popular with mod 60s styles and sometimes space-age styles too, often with very long tails. The aesthetic also brought the retro flicked-out style into the future. which in the 60s was known as the bouffant flip, made popular by Mary Tyler Moore's character on The Dick Van Dyke Show, Jackie Kennedy, Sally Field on Gidget, and many other actresses too. Y2k also made pigtails futuristic. They have a long history in many cultures, but were adopted in the 60s to represent the youthful generation that were very much determining the fashion of the era. And there were also more general 90s styles that were not originally from the 60s, but were also often styled futuristically for Y2k. Shoulder-length flat iron hair with short layers on the side was often seen, sometimes with a zigzag part which had a very futuristic aesthetic, as did crimped hair, which created an advanced technological texture within the aesthetic. Additionally, 90s megatrends like butterfly clips, glitter hair, and hair jewels all became a part of the aesthetic. For masculine trends, spiked hair, that was usually combined with bold blonde dye or frosted tips, was very popular, creating a multi-dimensional sci-fi style that was also a big part of rave culture. There was also curtain hair, which was popular with 90s teen heartthrobs. Historically, the look has been a part of the Edwardian era and gangs in the early 20th century, but it exploded in the 90s, particularly in boy bands, and became a prominent look of the Y2k aesthetic when combined with other futuristic trends. For beauty, makeup often worked within the Y2k colour palette and worked with shiny and iridescent motifs to emphasise the futuristic aesthetic. The most popular look of this aesthetic was frosted eyes. Think light shades of silver, blue, purple, and white. It has its history in makeup looks of the 60s and of the 70s, who often incorporated pale shimmer shadows inspired by disco balls and lights. But for the Y2k aesthetic, it was a celebration of light and cool tones associated with space. This trend was accompanied by light and cool toned skin that looked over-highlighted in music videos, and in makeup commercials. Then there was metallic makeup, made popular by brands like Urban Decay, who released their first line of metallic nail polishes and lipsticks in the mid-90s. The metallic shades complemented this aesthetic, as metallic was a strong futuristic motif. And then there was glitter, which was a broad trend of the 90s in general, but was incorporated into the aesthetic both as eyeshadow and body glitter. It created a kind of extraterrestrial illusion, and was a big part of rave culture. Rhinestones also played a big part in Y2k makeup, creating an ethereal sort of aesthetic to suit the futuristic look. They were also used to create beauty looks outside of the Western world, which were inspired by Y2k's utopian fantasy of this merging of all cultures. This included the appropriation of bindis, which are often worn for important religious significance, particularly amongst Hindus, and is often considered a representation of concealed wisdom and higher consciousness. This would have resonated with the aesthetic inspired by the open-ended possibilities of human minds in the future. Many styles of tribal makeup was also worn, and these are very general tribal styles and therefore hard to pinpoint any exact areas of influences, but tribal makeup has meant many different things to indigenous groups and tribes of the world for centuries, often being used in sacred ceremonies. Goth and drag makeup styles could also be seen in the aesthetic. Goth makeup usually features bold shapes and dark colours to represent appreciations of dark themes, while drag makeup exaggerates stereotypical female features. Their creative explorations of shapes and silhouettes inspired Y2k futuristic creativity. Not to mention cybergoth trends were a growing part of rave culture, and often incorporated sci-fi inspirations into their look. And of course, experimental sci-fi styles of makeup channeling extraterrestrial and technologically advanced motifs were everywhere in the aesthetic. Other visual cues. Special effects and tech motifs. The emergence of competent design systems, 3D modeling software, Photoshop, After Effects, and better video editing software in the early 90s led to a rise in special effects and visual imagery that are distinctively Y2k. This included things like motion blurring and technological motifs such as barcodes, matrix digital rain, binary codes, grids, holograms, and glitch effects. Additionally, a warped perspective in visuals was prominent, especially in music videos where a fisheye lens was testing the imagination of future perspectives. And finally, all periods of technology have their own distinct CGI look based on the capability of technologies of their time. The Y2k era computer graphics were distinct with their surreal, fake, and collaged appearance. Blobs and curves. One of the design themes made possible by Y2k technology is blobs and curves. They deserve their own section due to their sheer prevalence, being seen in many areas of design including architecture, also known as blobbytecture, biomorphic forms, techno fonts, blobjects, as in design objects with curvy smooth features, and even the revival of futuristic retro items of the 60s like lava lamps. hanging bubble chairs, and inflatable furniture. Two key designers in this field were Faiz Jafri and Karim Rashid, whose extensive work demonstrate the curvy and sleek look of the era. Why the blob design was considered such a strong visual cue of space and the future is up for debate, but it's likely because of how different it is to typical block designs. This makes it distinctively new and celebrates the possibilities of technology and design. The decline. As we moved into the early new millennium, the Y2k aesthetic slowly began declining. The celebration of the turn of the century was overshadowed by a contentious 2000 presidential election, September 11, and the subsequent announcement of the Iraq War. Additionally, the dot-com stock market bubble began to burst, as internet companies who did not have a business plan, good product, or track record of profits quickly went into bankruptcy, and this caused a massive decline in economic activity across developed countries. The beginning of the millennium was a rough one. Even though we had survived the threat of the Y2k bug, we seemed to be further and further away from the utopia the Y2k aesthetic was celebrating. Which brings me to a flaw I can see within this aesthetic. Fantasies and mythologies of the future and outer space have occurred throughout history and have an endless appeal to our imagination. For the most part, this is harmless, but it's also easy to see how this fantasy could be taken too far. After studying the Y2k aesthetic, I get the feeling that the utopian feeling about technology was a bit of an escape from reality, a way to ignore some very real and very serious problems. I found this particularly uncomfortable because this doesn't feel very far off how we interact with technology today, in that we often use it to disassociate or numb us from reality. It's concerning to think that this hasn't really changed in 23 years, and in fact it may have even gotten worse. However, you can definitely engage with the Y2k aesthetic and not use it as a means to escape, but rather as a celebration of human innovation. Similar to other futuristic aesthetics, it was an exploration of how humans interact with the unknown, what lies beyond time and space. The Y2k generation took this exploration to great heights, and in my opinion, it's one of the most creative and interesting aesthetics of the 21st century. What do you think of the Y2k aesthetic? Let me know in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. I'll see you soon.